Thank you very much for joining. My name is Dan Fagan, and I'm the director of the Science and Health and Environmental Reporting Program at NYU, otherwise known as SHERP. And this is our second to last Kavli Conversation of the semester. We have one more coming up on November 30th, which will actually not be on Zoom. It will be live streamed on YouTube. And it will be about improving and augmenting specialized coverage, including science, health, and environmental coverage and climate coverage for local markets. So we're really hitting two very hot topics in our industry right now, data visualization and local coverage, two things where there's a lot going on right now. So that will be November 30th. And as always, if you want to see archived versions of past Kavli Conversations, or you want to see what's coming up, including the November 30th conversation, you can go to journalism.nyu.edu/KC. I also wanted to mention that we are on Zoom, but we're going to use the Q&A box for questions and answers. I guess that's why they call it Q&A. So don't put questions in the chat. Instead, put them in the Q&A box, and Sara and the rest of our panelists will get to them as time allows. And there should be plenty of time to do this. Let's see. I think that's all the housekeeping I need to take care of. I just want to, as always, thank the Kavli Foundation for funding this program, making it possible. And so at this time, I want to introduce, well, first thank Kennedy and Alberto and Roz for joining us, and introduce Sara Chodosh, who will be moderating, and will also introduce the rest of our guests. Sara is a wonderful journalist and a graduate of the SHERP program. Let's see, she graduated in 2016. Right out of school, she went to Popular Science. She was a reporter and then an editor, and she always had a real affinity for data and graphics work. And now she's doing it full time. She just took a new job at the New York Times as a graphics editor on the opinion desk. And she was just telling me that they put her right to work right away. Which is good. There's a good long journalistic tradition of doing just that. So welcome everyone. And with that, I will turn my screen off. So you don't want to see me, you want to see the guests, and turn things over to Sara. So take it away, Sara.
Thanks, Dan. Very surreal to be hosting one of these when I used to attend as a student. Okay, I'm gonna run through some introductions for our panelists. We have really, really wonderful panelists. I was extremely excited to get all three of these people to join us tonight. So first we have Roz Pearce, who is a visual data journalist at The Economist, where she makes charts about pretty much everything from vaccines to military spending. And before that, she focused on climate change graphics specifically for Carbon Brief. We also have Alberto Cairo, who is the Knight Chair in Visual Journalism at the University of Miami School of Communication. He is also a visual journalist who has worked all over the world and for pretty much everyone at this point, it seems. And he's written multiple books on data visualization, including The Functional Art and How Charts Lie, which are two of my favorite books on data viz. And finally, we have Kennedy Elliot, who is the Director of Interactive Storytelling at National Geographic. And prior to that, worked at both the Washington Post and The Guardian, producing interactive news graphics about, again, just about every topic you can imagine, from police shootings to groundhog forecasts, which was a particularly adorable one. So just a reminder to put your questions in the chat. We've got some things prepared, including some visuals, obviously, but we would love to have this be a really organic discussion. So if something pops up that Dan or I spot, we're gonna sort of veer off as we feel free. And I'm also going to give like a little bit of a disclaimer up front to just say, Dan is correcting me. that I may have said you should put your questions in the chat, and what I meant was in the Q&A. So if I misspoke, I apologize. But yeah, so some of the questions tonight are going to be a little bit broad because the basics of visual journalism are like kind of the same, whether you're doing it about climate change or any other topic. But you know, we're going to try to angle it specifically towards climate change, but we may get a little bit more broad depending on what we talk about. So I kind of wanted to start with like the beginning of the graphics making process. Like, how is a climate graphic born? It obviously starts out with data, and if I can, apologies that we're going to be a little clunky tonight with sharing our screens. I wanted to start with I think personally, sort of one of the prototypical climate graphics. We are quite literally looking at global warming. Like, it's the classic hockey stick graph. You've seen it a million times over and over again. And so my first question is basically, how do you go about finding a visual story to tell about the climate that isn't this? This is hugely valuable. This is a foundation. But it's also been told a lot. So how do you guys approach finding something new to say? And I'm going to stop sharing. And if anyone wants me to bring anything back up, I will do so. But I suspect it's a better viewing process for everybody if it's our faces. Who wants to start?
I'll dig in. I mean, I think charts like that are very important scene setters, but I do agree. I think we've all seen them a lot, especially folks that are immersed in this topic, which, depending on who you talk to, 2019 or 2020 was the year that everyone woke up to climate change. So hopefully we're all somewhat familiar. Most Americans, at least, are all familiar with charts like that. But I feel like it's a tough topic to talk about, and this is kind of a big answer, so maybe I'll try to keep it brief and let others kind of chime in. But it is a tough topic to cover as a journalist, and definitely as a visual journalist, because readers have a hard time processing climate change for various reasons. I mean, we know that it's a very depressing topic. People have, struggle with accepting that it is happening, and they might not feel the effects that are happening around them in their geographic location, which might make it seem a little bit more of a distant issue. It's also very long-term, and we need very short-term actions at this moment. So it's hard to get readers to feel this issue. And so charts like the one that you just showed are important, but they're not necessarily effectual anymore to really describe the urgency that's needed, or the peril that we're facing here with this issue. So I feel like some of the ones that some of the graphics and interactives that I've seen in the last few years that have been really have made an impact on me have been ones that have put maybe like a local context, like talked about the area that I live in currently, and shown how that maybe compares to other areas around the world, pulls out the most drastic changes that we'll see. They do other things to make me feel the urgency, or feel the issue at hand, rather than just a chart.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I think it's quite a difficult topic to report on as a data journalist, because doing any kind of like original new modeling isn't necessarily something that most data journalists will be able to do, because it requires a lot of very specialized knowledge to do any kind of original climate modeling. So often you're more likely to just be sort of presenting data that's already been created or analyzed in a new way, or for a particular audience with a particular focus.
I mean, I am much less current than my colleagues here, because I don't work in news media anymore. I just teach people how to do this type of work. However, I still collaborate with several people producing graphics that are not related necessarily to climate change, but to other topics. And when I was preparing for this event, I thought about one of the projects that I art directed this last year for a couple of media organizations in Brazil, and also for the Washington Post, titled "At the Epicenter," which essentially I asked the question. I'm going to put the link to in the chat window. It essentially asks the question: what would happen if all COVID deaths had happened around you, right? So it asks you to. It's not current, so it uses older figures from COVID-19, when deaths in the United States were still at the 200,000 level or something like that. But essentially what it does is that you can input your address over there, and it will show you how big the circle around you would be if everybody who died of COVID-19 in the United States were your neighbors, right? So what I'm getting at is that more and more throughout the years, and this may sound like a paradox, and it could be a topic of conversation, I have become more and more skeptical about the persuasive power of data visualization alone. And I have become more convinced that data visualization alone, or even traditional news infographics alone, are not enough to do the job that we want to do, which is to persuade people about the reality of climate change. That we need to pair data visualization and infographics with other techniques that we can borrow from the world of video games, for example, from the world of cinema, movies, from the world of traditional verbal journalistic communication, and always use the graphics to support those types of messages. And we can discuss about other, we can discuss about other projects later on. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so what you've kind of, especially Kennedy and Alberto, pulled out there is something I also want to talk about tonight, which is kind of broadly about framing. Like, as Kennedy said, climate change is such a huge issue, and it's a pretty abstract issue for a lot of people. It's getting more and more concrete every year, which is convenient if you're visualizing it and trying to convey just how serious it is. But I think like maybe the most common and probably the most effective way to sort of get people to care is, like, I've heard it called the you filter or the me filter, to make the impacts of something feel like they are happening to you. I think I should also probably put a link in the chat, and I will when I get a sec. But I'm curious, how do you guys feel about the you or the me filter, and are there other ways that you've found that are effective for making people care about something that feels like it's happening to an abstract planet far away from them?
I don't think it's like, I think given all the extreme weather events we've had in the last few years, I think actually like we haven't had to engineer that so much, just because there's been loads of events that have touched people personally. So I think extreme weather is a great example for just a way of doing that without having to kind of artificially, engineer that.
Yeah, I think that's one way to do it. I mean, it definitely can be, I mean, I guess it depends on execution, but that definitely can help, especially if you're put your location in context of maybe some of the worst felt areas, to kind of see how much it is. But there's one I'm thinking of, I'm trying to find it right now. I'll put it in the chat, where I feel like it's a New York Times graphic, and it's talking about it's talking about how summers are getting hotter. It's, I think, an older piece that they reimagined. But let me put that in the list or the chat room. But it's another chart. It's not anything. I mean, it's just a chart. But I like the way that it compares, baseline period to the way that things are trending. And you really, I don't know, just the fact that it's like kind of an area chart makes you really understand how much is shifting in this one. And I think about this one a lot. I think it's just a really nice, simple piece, and it's, doesn't have a lot of heft to it, but I don't think it's intending to. And something about the area chart of it makes me, I guess, drives that point home, how much things are changing.
In my opinion, connected to what I was saying before, I have come to believe that people in general don't trust numbers alone or graphics alone. There are several factors that we can add to a visualization to an infographic that might make it more persuasive. And the first one of them is a friendly voice. Someone who speaks over the graphic and talks about the graphic and explains the graphic. Perfect example of that would be, for example, the famous Professor Hans Rosling talking about global health and human development and stuff like that. I wish that there were a similar figure I'm actually going to put a link to Rosling's work here, down there. So a Rosling-like figure who talked about climate change, combining it with data visualization. I mean, I guess that the former president Al Gore will be someone like that, who did this in a documentary many years ago. But obviously Al Gore is a Democrat, and so it's a politically charged figure, and he would not be as persuasive as a Rosling person who's sort of like political neutral. That's the first factor, a friendly voice. The second one, I think, throughout the years, I have also come to believe that abstract data visualizations like the hockey stick chart, which I absolutely love, like that is one of the best visualizations produced in the 20th century. They are only persuasive to a specific segment of audience. All right, other types of audiences need other types of graphics. And I've always been in love with pictorial visualizations. I don't know if you ever saw this visualization by Reuters, which visualizes how many plastic bottles are produced or are consumed in a year. And they don't do a graph. They do a sort of like 1 million plastic bottles falling from the sky. And they show you through the sheer amount of the accumulation of bottles on screen, they show you the sheer amount of plastic that is consumed. So it makes the data almost, touchable, physical, and it makes it very, very direct, right? It doesn't create that layer of abstraction that data visualization makes. By the way, an aside, it does that for a very good reason, right? Because data visualization is in reality not a device to sort of like persuade people. It is more for analysis. It was created for analysis. So it makes a lot of sense that the representation of the data is quite abstract. Or this other visualization from Reuters, which shows air pollution in India, in Delhi, if I remember well. And it shows that through a sequence of photographs, right? And it pairs that with visualizations. So it achieves the best of both worlds. It shows you the data in an abstract format, but then it makes the data concrete, but by showing you the results, right? And then, as you were saying before, Sara, the me factor or the me layer, putting myself, how is it going to affect me, right? What this thing looks like if it happened around me, right? As Ross mentioned before, we all sort of like experienced this already because of the extreme weather events that we have been suffering the past few years. Living down here in Miami, I get to experience climate change on a regular basis, right? So through, rising sea levels and constant flooding and so on and so forth, right? But what does it look like? What is it going to look like in the near future? Might it be possible, for example, to create virtual reality experiences or more pictorial visualizations that show people what would it look like if sea level rises by 6 feet in your area, right? And there's a classical graphic by a classic visualization by the Weather Channel from a couple of years back that shows you a storm surge, right, during a hurricane, right? What does it look like, right? It's like living down here in Miami. When I moved here, people told me, well, if there's a hurricane, there's going to be a storm surge of 6 feet. I'm European, we don't use feet. That's crazy, we use meters, right? What does that look like, right? How big is that, right? Well, I discovered later that 6 feet is the height of my older child. So now I can figure out how high that is. But that is wonderful. I mean, that weather channel visualization puts you in the middle. It shows you a presenter, and then it shows you storm surge around that presenter. Can we use all these techniques? Can we find a way to try to put people in the middle of whatever is happening? When we make the data a little bit more visceral, in some sense, it also becomes a little bit more persuasive, as far as I have observed throughout the years.
So it's interesting because what I think all of those techniques that you just listed have in common is they're evoking emotion in whoever is like either reading it or watching it in the case of some kind of video, which makes a lot of sense because if you know, a graph, a hockey stick graph doesn't feel immediate in the way that like, I mean, that the storm surge, I think I posted one video, but I think it's been used like a few times now on the Weather Channel. That's incredibly evocative. I never fully appreciated how dangerous storm surges were until I watched that video. And I wrote about storm surges all the time prior to seeing it. I think that the emotion is especially tricky though for climate change, like the, you know, the links that Alberto posted, I think are exceptions, but I think in general, it's hard to, especially to sort of find data that is going to enable you to say something emotional, because especially because it's challenging. You know, learning how to visualize data is a skill in and of itself. You know, as a percentage of journalists, not that many people do it, fewer do it well. So it's like, I simultaneously completely agree with you that those are pathways to creating a really excellent climate graphic. And I'm also sympathetic to the fact that it's so hard. It's the rare climate graphic that really makes you feel climate change immediately.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, that is so wonderful when you can get that visceral, you can evoke those visceral reactions from readers. But Alberto, you used a word 2 or 3 times when you're speaking just now, which is really interesting. You're talking about persuasive graphics. I'm sure that's a topic that you think about very often. But I think for me, just as someone working in news, my primary purpose is not necessarily to make a persuasive graphic. However, that is definitely others' goals, like their primary goal. I would say that I don't know. I mean, maybe you guys can help me with this, but I guess if I had to sum it up in a sentence, my primary goal is to inform. But I will say evoking visceral reaction is definitely, you know, the icing on the cake if you can make it happen. And I agree, Sarah, I have the same, you know, woes with trying to evoke that with climate change data, especially. And Alberto, I don't know if you're only talking about those kinds of graphics, but you mentioned that a couple times. But I feel like it's still important to kind of talk about this because it's not necessarily that I don't want to be persuasive or I don't want to evoke visceral reaction. It's just that climate change makes it so much harder to do that because it's a topic that I feel like everyone is maybe a little burned out on. Maybe it's a tough topic to wrap people's heads around. There's so much basic information that we have to build upon to get to that really interesting factoid that we're trying to emphasize in this one particular piece. It's just such a complicated issue. But I just appreciate that we're kind of all coming at it from different angles and different motivations with this. And I think, you know, ultimately our goal is to have something that like evokes emotion. But I guess for me, I would say that ideally, I would like to evoke curiosity in a reader, like just to pause and say, this is really interesting, or this is an interesting way to view this data. That would be like my ideal scenario, not necessarily to persuade.
But that's an emotion too, right? It's like when I talk about persuasive graphics, I don't mean that you have a particular agenda and you want to persuade something of a particular idea that you have in mind beforehand. You want to persuade them about the fact that this is an important issue and they should pay attention to it, right? And then make up their minds, right? But you need to persuade them to get into this story in the first place, and then, you know, look at it because you want to persuade them in some way that it's an important thing worth discussing. In my opinion, we journalists are a little bit, have always been a little bit wary for good reason about, you know, trying not to sound too subjective, try to show both sides of an issue and things like that. And all for good reason. I completely understand where we come from. But when it comes to topics such as, I don't know, climate change, the effectiveness of vaccines, I don't know, the reality of the evolution by natural selection. I mean, there are not really two sides to that story, right? It's like there are not two sides. There are many conversations, many discussions, many uncertainties that are worth discussing, but sort of like the core messages around those stories as clear cut as it gets. I mean, climate change is real, right? evolution happened, and we see it happening every day, and vaccines work. It's like those things don't have two sides, and therefore I think that talking about persuasion in journalism is worthwhile and is ethical, just because we believe it, right? We believe that is the case, and we have evidence to believe that those things are real, and therefore we want to communicate that. We don't want to persuade people exactly to make them think exactly what we think, but we want to persuade them to the fact that, again, it's a topic worth discussing, a topic worth studying, and a topic worth debating to find solutions as a society.
This reminded me a bit of some research that was done by this organization called Climate Visuals. I'm just going to put it in the chat. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of them. But yeah, they did some research into what kind of images are likely to sort of persuade people in climate change and switch them on and switch them off. And it was really interesting, actually, because they sort of both found that images that are really emotionally powerful are like particularly persuasive, and people will really engage with that. But also in climate change, there's a lot of images that are very overused. So like a polar bear like clinging to a iceberg, you know, and those kind of ones really switch people off. And also images of like protests also really switch people off. So yeah, I just thought that was relevant to what we were just talking about in terms of persuading people and trying to provoke an emotional reaction. Although I would actually say in my own work, it's not something I try to do very much. I generally focus more on communication.
So I think the issue of persuading versus like informing kind of brings up an issue that is not unique to climate change, but perhaps unique to like climate change and vaccines right now, which is, who do you think you're talking to? Like, who is your audience? Is your audience, or maybe like, you know, some of this is related to what outlet are you writing for at the time, and like who realistically is reading those stories. But also, I'm curious how you guys think about who you are trying to speak to. Are you speaking to people who already think that climate change is a huge problem and want to know more information? Are you speaking to someone who maybe doesn't think that climate change is real and you maybe are trying to persuade them, or at least trying not to just completely turn them off and send them farther in the other direction? This is something I thought about a lot when I was at Popular Science, because there was some change over time, but especially when I was there at the beginning, it was a magazine, certainly, and to some extent a website that was read by a lot of people in middle America, like 30 to 50-year-old white men who maybe didn't super believe in climate change despite it being a science outlet. And that was something I kept in mind a lot when I was writing, that the tone with which I might treat something because I believe in climate change and everyone I interact with believes in climate change, or at least I think they do, but that was not who I should be speaking to if I maybe wanted to do like the most social good. So how do you guys think about that?
That's really interesting. I would also like to know just personally how your style has maybe changed from Pop Sci to New York Times, but you don't have to answer that. I'm just putting you on the spot. But that's a really good question.
Yes, she does. I'm curious about that too.
I haven't written about climate change at the Times yet. I've only been there a few weeks. So I guess I would say, though, at the Times, I'd probably feel, I mean, I'm also in the opinion section, so I'm now in the business of persuading people potentially. But at the Times, I'd probably feel a lot more latitude to, I guess, express things in pretty strong terms. But writing in the opinion section, I'd actually be inclined to take a similar approach that I took at Pop Sci, which is to not assume that the person's already on my side. That if the beginning of my story is offensive or makes fun of people who don't believe in climate change or acts like that's a fringe belief that only idiots believe in, is a really good way for those people to not read my story. And the truth is, at the end of the day, if what I want is for more people to think climate change is a serious issue, which I do, I am actually not trying to speak to people who already think it's a problem.
That's really interesting. I didn't really consider that working in the opinion section would maybe make it necessary to kind of start from a more basic level. But that's a really, really good point. I didn't even think of it that way. I think that at Nat Geo, our editor-in-chief has been very clear that we are on the side of science. So we, I think, pretty generally work off of the assumption that our readers have accepted, you know, the consensus of scientists. We work off of there, but with our COVID coverage, I did see a lot of, I mean, nothing that goes against that, but we did a lot of more explainer type things that were some things like a little bit more of a basic level, like, you know, lots of scientific confusion out there on social media about COVID, obviously. And so I saw some of our coverage kind of debunking, not really debunking, setting out to like debunk that particular myth, but addressing it and talking about it in a very like a basic kind of way, and that they did really well. So, but I think climate change, we're able to take a little bit more of like a, you know, we're maybe to go to the next level of where we expect our readers to be.
I'd say it's probably a similar story at The Economist as to National Geographic. I don't think I ever have really thought about trying to sort of persuade climate skeptics with my work. I kind of work off the assumption that most of our readers probably aren't, although maybe I should think about it a bit more actually. But yeah, I generally assume that they're going to be sort of on the side of science.
I have a question for all of you, and this is based on my own experience becoming a professor slash quotation marks researcher, or although I've never been a full-blown researcher. Do you conduct any type of sort of like reader studies? Do you do, I don't know, focus groups with the people who read our graphics, or have you done any testing with actual readers, you know, the Midwestern white man that Sara was mentioning before, you know, I don't know, the highly educated reader of the New York Times who lives in Manhattan? Have you observed how they read visualizations? This is not a tricky question, okay? It's like, I'm really curious about it. And then I will add something else perhaps later.
Sorry, was that a question for me?
For everybody,
for everyone.
The three of us, yeah. Have you done any sort of testing? Because I tell you, when I worked in the industry, I never did testing, right? So that's the reason why I'm asking.
We did do some testing when we first launched our graphic detail section, which is a section dedicated specifically to sort of data journalism and data visualization. And we basically found that we were like trying to be a bit too clever. We were doing sort of really fancy this is actually before I joined, but they were doing really fancy visualizations, and actually sometimes it's better to keep it a bit more simple, because if you try and do something more complicated, you're basically asking more time from the reader, because they have to sort of learn how to understand the graphic as well as learn what the main message of the graphic is. And I think that's actually a really important lesson for climate change too. If you try and do a sort of really unusual type of visualization, you're sort of creating a barrier of understanding for your reader.
Kennedy,
really no, if we have done testing, that information has not trickled down to me. I always have the same fascination and question, Alberto. I always want to know who's doing what and what kind of information is being out there. But I think we kind of, I mean, it probably isn't a surprise, but we, you know, obviously a big thing that informs what we should cover and what's useful to our readers is just clicks that stories get, you know, how popular they are. And so that's a big, you know, that's a lot of information for us and helps us inform what stuff we're going to cover.
I will say at PopSci, the audience was something we actually talked about a fair amount, but I think that was mainly because a lot I'm going to go ahead and say pretty much all of our editors were not at all the demographic that especially the print magazine reached. And so it was like we did a climate change issue. We did not call it the climate change issue. And we tried to put the phrase climate change in as little as possible. We called it the weather issue. And that was like a conversation we had was, are we going to put out, if we put out a magazine that says the climate change issue, how many of our readers are going to throw it in the trash when it turns up in the mail? Alberto, I'm curious what you were going to add though.
I was going to add that, I mean, you all know me. I mean, I've worked doing infographics. I've been working in infographics since 1997 or something like that. And the problem that Ross mentioned before about trying to be too clever, I've been there. I've done that plenty of times, right? Tons and tons and tons of times. I mean, one of the recent experiences that opened my mind was to work in hurricane maps. Sara, you mentioned before my latest book, How Chats Lie, in which I talk at length about the cone of uncertainty and how people misread that, and how to read it better, and so on and so forth. That is all based on the research that I've been participating in on how people misread cones of uncertainty from the National Hurricane Center. And I even wrote a piece for the New York Times a couple of years ago explaining people how to read the code. I wish that we did more of this type of thing more often, right? How to read a hockey stick chart, how to read, I don't know, any other type of graphic that appears in the IPCC reports, how to read these things, how to interpret the gray area behind the line in the that is 2 standard deviations from the, if I remember well, from the point estimate in the hockey stick chart, and so on and so forth. I wish that we did this more often with more types of graphics. And the reason why I say this is that people don't get them. They don't understand them. They don't know what they are looking at. And they make all sorts of inferences because we are still, and I speak about myself, I'm not criticizing anybody here, I'm criticizing myself perhaps 5 or 6 years ago. We're still stuck in a frame of mind in which we still, keep repeating things such as a picture is worth 1,000 words, or show me, don't tell me, and so on and so forth. That is not true. People look at our graphics and they come up with all sorts of inferences. Visualizations need to be explained, I think. They need to be talked about. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned, for example, rustling at the beginning of the event, right? A person who shows himself, in this case, in front of a visualization, shows you the visualization, but contextualizes the visualization, not only by talking about the data that is being shown in the visualization, but also talking about how to read that visualization in particular. That will expand, I think, people's minds in terms of accepting, less traditional types of graphics in that sense, but also understanding graphics that are used on a regular basis to communicate these types of issues. And there is another side of the coin, which is that, and again, this connects with what Ross mentioned before about trying to be too smart, right? Myself, longtime designer, more than 20 years of experience working in the field. I get the National Hurricane Center map and I said, I'm going to redesign this thing, applying the rules of visualization, the rules of design. And I created several alternative versions of the National Hurricane Center cone of uncertainty, and they failed miserably. People didn't understand anything that I had designed. So that opens your eyes. I mean, it makes you humbler, right? It makes you a little bit more wary about being too certain about your own opinions or your own takes, just because you face the test of reality. You face the test of a reader. One of the things that I'm saying in the book that I should be writing at this point, and I am not, because it needs to be published next year, hopefully, is that traditionally we designers of visualizations, and I include myself in that sentence, we speak too much about good graphics or bad graphics, depending on whether they follow the rules or they don't follow the rules of visualization, right? And I put myself in that bag, but I changed my mind. And one of the things that I have written already to put in that book is that the only test for whether a graphic is good or bad is whether it delivers, whether it's understood, whether if it follows the rule or doesn't follow the rules, I don't care. right? I don't care if it follows the rules, as long as it succeeds at communicating this message. And I'm going to close this very long, rambling speech because I have all these very fresh in my mind. In that book that I'm writing, I think that I'm going to open it up with an interview with Ed Hopkins, the author of the Warming Stripes graphic, which we could put in the chat window perhaps. I'm going to actually look it up, Warming Stripes. So this is a visualization that became famous a few years ago. It's showyourstripes.info, that's the website, right? It appear everywhere, essentially. It's super, super famous. You used it in the promotion of this event, if I remember well, in the background. I talked to Ed, and he said that one of the most common reactions in the visualization community was to say, well, but this doesn't follow the rules. It doesn't have this, it doesn't have a scales. It doesn't have a time scale. It doesn't have a color scale. And I said, but people loved it. And I have a lot of evidence to show that many people were shocked, were interested. It opened up conversations about climate change with people who were a little bit wary or a little bit skeptical about climate change. They saw the graphic, and I could open a conversation thanks to the graphic. That's success, right? It succeeds, even if it doesn't follow the rules. If it works, it's good. If it doesn't work, it's not good. Right?
I have a lot of thoughts, but Dan messaged me to say he has a question. You should jump in, and then I've got a lot more thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And this is, I thought I would jump in for two reasons. Number one is just housekeeping. It really is okay to ask questions. We're 45 minutes in, halfway done, and so we really would like this to be interactive. So please do use the Q&A box as questions arise. The second thing is that I have just found this so mind expanding. I'm already thinking about visualizations in a much more expansive way than as a print reporter I generally think of them, which is just sort of numbers on paper. So it's been fantastic in that sense. I do think there are a lot of people listening. We have some people listening, watching, who have very advanced data viz skills already. But we have a lot of people who have essentially no skills, but they're good journalists and they would like to learn to do this. So I think it would be really helpful just for each of you, just really briefly to say, what advice would you give to just get started? We've got people with good journalistic minds, but they don't necessarily have coding experience. Maybe they do, or maybe they don't. And they find the process very intimidating. So what would you advise? I don't know who wants to start.
I was going to say I can call on someone if no one wants to jump in.
I'm happy to take a stab at it, and I fully would love Roz and Alberto to advise and correct me. I think a good I don't know, this suggestion has served me well, not just in climate change, but I feel like, everything we're talking about with climate change is a huge topic. It's really complicated. There are lots of different facets of it that you can dive into. There's no shortage of information there. I think this is like a tried and true piece of advice for any journalist, and not necessarily a visualization piece of advice. But I would say listen to that little nagging voice inside of you when you're reading about a topic and you don't fully understand something and you think the thing that you're reading isn't fully describing or answering the question that you have, because sometimes those gaps in our knowledge can be gaps that are shared with other readers. And when you pursue those things, you're really answering that question for a lot of people, and it ends up being quite popular, quite necessary to establish that information. So just pay attention to that little voice. You're not, oftentimes when I'm reading stuff, I'm like, oh, it's me that doesn't understand the thing. I have a problem, but that's not true. It's just that some things there's just so much information to learn about with climate change that things can slip through the cracks. So I would say listen to that little voice. And we know that simple charts can be extremely effective and extremely clear in communicating information. So I don't think that you should think of, big interactive flashy things as being better at all. I don't know if that's common these days anyway, but I definitely don't think of them like that. I'm sure people on this panel don't think like that either. So I think just pay attention to that little voice that's urging you to pursue some little thing that you don't quite understand. And I would bet that a lot of other people have the same question as you, and however you can describe that visually, whether it's simple, straightforward charts or something a little bit more, complicated, that could be a good start. It's probably not quite what you're asking.
Excellent advice, though.
That's excellent advice. Very good advice.
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to add that visualization is actually like a really good way of sort of finding stories and exploring data. So my advice would be to learn a tool that will allow you to do a bit of exploratory data visualization, whether it's like R or ggplots, because you can often find interesting things with that. And sometimes climate change data is in slightly sort of intimidating formats like netcdf files or whatever, but don't worry about that. There's loads of tutorials. It's not as hard as it looks. And there's loads of really cool satellite
maybe
data.
we should explain what ggplot is.
Yeah, can you explain what you mean,
The audience
Roz?
don't know what it is.
And maybe put some resources in the
I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
I was just going to say, yeah. So ggplot's just a visualization library from R, which is a statistical programming language, I think. But yeah, it's not as hard to learn as you might think. Like if you can use Excel, you should be able to use R.
My classes at the University of Miami are taken by students of all backgrounds, from data science, highly advanced programmers, coders, etc., to journalists who have no idea how to draw a perfect circle using a pen. But by the end of the semester, all of them are capable of producing, pretty decent publishable static visualizations. And that is the reason why I think is that I approach the teaching of visualization in a similar way that I would approach the teaching of writing, which is that this is not magic. It's like it consists of applying a set of symbols and a grammar that tell you how to arrange those symbols in order to communicate a message. If you understand the symbols, if you understand the grammar, and then you have something to say, you will be able to use this language to communicate clearly. It's as simple as that. Obviously, then it takes work, right? It takes an entire semester of, hitting yourself against a wall, sleepless nights working on Professor Cairo's assignments until you get them finished, and then getting them critiqued in class. I'm super gentle in my critique, but I'm also quite firm in, returning students' work with tons of red marks and, providing advice and so on and so forth. This is a craft. It is not a science. It's backed by science. It is based on perceptual science, cognitive science, and when I teach, I also discuss all these issues. But it's essentially a craft. And the advice that the three of you gave, Sara, Kennedy, and Rosamund, of beginning small, it's great advice. It's like when I remember that when I began my career, right, I had like heroes in this field, right? I remember, John Grimwade from Condé Nast Traveler, Fernando Baptista, who is right now at National Geographic magazine. Those are the people like that were like the leaders in the field. And today it's people like you three, right? It's like Sara, Kennedy, fantastic, right? Great work. It is very easy for a beginner to get overwhelmed by the quality of the work that you want to produce. And I know this because I show my students the work that people like you produce. I said, I will never be able to produce anything like this. And I usually tell them, neither can I. I will never be able to do anything like Fernando Baptista, right, from National Geographic. He's a god, in this field. But that doesn't really matter. You don't need to compare yourself to people like that, right? You need to compare yourself to yourself a few days ago. Are you doing it better than you did like a week ago or a month ago? If the answer is yes, then you are making progress. So begin small. Begin with small charts. Publish them, get them critique, get some feedback, go back to the drawing board, try something a little bit more complex. And through the same process that we used to learn how to write correctly, right? Now, there are many resources to do this though. And I think that one of the best resources is this website, journalismcourses.org. This is a website put together by the Knight Center at the University of Texas in Austin that offers a massive online courses, paid for courses of different kinds, and older courses. The material of older courses are stored in the website. So for example, you can find a couple of courses that I taught for free, introductions to data visualizations. You can just Google my name along with this website and you will find the material of these courses. There are a couple of courses about data journalism and data analysis that are also free. It's just like just start completing some of these courses, learn a little bit about the tools that the instructors in these courses use, start practicing, right? Start putting the principles in practice, start putting the work out. It's just a matter of, I mean, we human beings learn by doing, learn by making, right? So it's a matter of studying, but it's also a matter of practicing.
I would also, this was all excellent advice and very different advice, which I appreciate. I would also say, kind of more specifically, maybe, I remember when I was starting out, I felt like exactly what Alberto said, that I was never ever going to be able to make the kinds of things that my data viz heroes were going to make. Part of that was just like a lack of self-belief. And part of it was also the logistical that, to do that level of journalism and visualization, there's a lot of coding you need to learn. And that's just, it's a lot of material to take in. And way more people could do it than think they can do it. But it's a lot of learning, especially if you have a job and your job isn't data viz. You have to, I spent a lot of time teaching myself R on the weekends and they weren't great weekends. So I would say, like, if what you want is to sort of dive in, try not to get too caught up in using the fanciest tools. Like, you don't need to learn JavaScript to make a graph. You can make a graph in Excel, and if you're lucky enough to get an Adobe license, you can edit it in Illustrator and make it look beautiful. You could use Data Wrapper. Data Wrapper is a really excellent tool. It enables you to drop your data in and make a pretty nice looking chart in like 5 minutes. And you can sit there and play around with the settings and figure out what looks good. Alberto will drop the link, thank you. I think that people can get a bit, snobby is not quite the right word, but can get a little bit caught up in using the fanciest tools. If you can make a really effective chart with a simple tool, that's just as good as making a fancy coded version.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that as well, actually. I think these off-the-shelf tools are really good for people who aren't necessarily confident in graphic design, because it does a lot of that work for you. Whereas like a more custom tool like R or D3, you need to sort of do a lot of that yourself.
Yeah, it also kind of...
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. I was gonna veer off a little bit, so you go.
No, I was just about to add that I added a link to Data Wrapper and also to Flourish, which is another tool that also lets you create interactive data visualizations on the fly, just in a matter of seconds. And this image that I have just posted is a diagram that shows the tools that I usually sort of like cover or talk about in my classes. Only one of them involves a little bit of code, which is R. I do expose the students to a little bit of R code. R is the letter R, for those of you in the audience who don't know what we're talking about. It's a statistical programming language. I highly recommend it. I am not a coder. I hate JavaScript with all my heart, and I don't like Python. But R is very dear to me because I got into it and it was super easy to get things done. And if you really, really want to learn, there's an excellent resource, which is free, which is a book titled R for Data Science by Hadley Wickham. If you just Google R for Data Science, you will find it. It's free. And then also Klaus Wilke's visualization book, Fundamentals of Data Visualization. It's also available for free online. I'm actually trying to find the link right now. This is one of the best introductions to data visualization that I think has ever been written. There are many, many others. But this is really good introduction, and it focuses. It has a lot of examples of scientific visualizations. It's a really good book, and the examples in the book were created with the, if I remember well, with the R programming language. And I think that the code behind these graphics can be downloaded. That said, those in the audience, as Sara was saying, you don't need to learn how to code at the very beginning. You can get away with tools such as Data Wrapper, Flourish, Excel, Adobe Illustrator, Tableau. You can get a lot of things done with all these tools, and then learn the basics. Get some, do some tests, publish some graphics, get them critique, get better, learn the language, learn the symbols, learn the grammar of visualization, and then jump to the next step, which is to start sort of like fully customizing visualizations and making those visualizations interactive, but by learning actual web code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That will be sort of like the learning path that we try to reproduce, for example, at the University of Miami, with the sequence of classes that we offer. We begin with the basics, we continue with interactive graphics, then we continue with more advanced stuff. It's possible to do something like this on your own.
I'll just add that I've heard great things about Alberto's books as well, so you might want to check those out too. Thank you all very much for your answers. I feel less intimidated already. Go ahead, Sara. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's okay. That was great. I was just going to say, I guess to attempt to tie these things together into something else I wanted to talk about that we were sort of touching on before, which is I would say kind of inherent tension between making a graph like really beautiful, something that would win a fancy award, say, and making a really simple chart that the maximum number of people are going to be able to understand. And I'm curious how you guys approach finding that balance. Like I think that the longer you do data viz, possibly, or maybe it's just me, the more you want to branch out and try new types of graphs and make something more interesting than a bar chart, even if a bar chart is maybe the clearest way to convey what it is that you're talking about. I know for me, the number one thing I do if I think I have, well, I try to do it always, but especially if I think I have something confusing, is to put a title on it. A title is like the number one way I found that I could get other people to immediately understand what my graph was trying to say. Is like, it's not a visual choice. It's just put the title and make the title what you want people to take away from the graph. So that's more of a prompt than a question, I guess. But how do you guys approach balancing like the aesthetics with being really understandable?
I think it's interesting you said that as you go on, you wanted to branch out and make more different types of visualizations, because I think I had the opposite journey. When I first got into it, I wanted to do like really crazy things. I had like all these sort of like novel like ways of inventing new types of data visualizations. And then I realized that actually sometimes it's like just a plain old bar chart or a line chart is definitely the best way of telling the story. So I think I err more on the side of that now. Well, obviously, sometimes wanting to dip my toes into something a bit more interesting.
Yours is the smarter path, for the record.
I mean, you should have seen some of my early work.
I love that, Roz. I really, really love that. I can relate to that a lot. And yeah, my early work, just I can't even look at it. I think that's really interesting. I think that's a really good question. I guess, ultimately the answer is always, it's a case-by-case basis. But I think for me, it pays off more to have it be understandable to the audience than have it be really novel or, aesthetically daring. Although that is really fun, and it's always good to experiment and try new things. So I'm not discouraging that at all. But I think ultimately it wins out to make it definitely understandable by the audience. And I think that, I'm just trying to think about some of the last bigger projects. What I think I've been experimenting with lately is not necessarily like new charting types, but like maybe just like different ways to think about information, or more like immersive kind of story forms. I don't know. They're just other things other than like, experimenting with a charting type to make it novel. That's not the only way to kind of grab attention, I guess. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I would just to piggyback on what something that Sarah mentioned before about titles. I think that it's extremely important to think about the writing in our visualizations. When I grade my students, for example, I don't grade them based just on the visuals that they design or how skilled they are using a particular tool or how cool their visualizations look like. I grade them on the title, on the intro, on what we call in visualization. I think that it was Amanda Cox from the New York Times who came up with the name, with the term, the annotation layer of a visualization. Well, more and more we have some tentative empirical evidence showing that the annotation layer is as important as the visualization itself, if not more, because a good title can anchor your attention to the graphic. A good annotation can give you a hint of what the graphic is actually showing, or a clue about how to read the graphic itself. I was just trying to, while you were talking about, I was typing really quickly to find this recent research project from Northwestern, which shows that, I haven't read it all yet, but it talks about that. It talks about the importance of what they call focus graphics, providing a focus or something to grasp, right? Which can be provided through the title of a visualization, for example, right? More and more I have come to believe that that is one of the most critical parts of designing any sort of graphic, to the point that, you know, looking at my past, and Kennedy also, if you take a look at my first graphics, they are also horrible. It's like, right, when we look at the past, we are horrified by the things that we did. But, you know, I have, throughout the years, intuitively, I already knew this, to the point that when I was designing any sort of visualization or any sort of narrative piece based on sequences of visualization, sequences of charts or maps, etc., the first thing that I did was not to draw anything or to design anything. It was to write. I wrote like a script of what I wanted to say. And that script worked as the skeleton of the visualization. I was writing a story in some sense. It is only that the way that I write stories is not through words alone. It's through the combination of those words organically integrated with visuals that feed into the words and the word feed into the visual somehow. I think that perfect integration between the graphics and the text in a story can only be accomplished if you do these two things in parallel, side by side. Try to think about what you should tell through the graphic, what you should tell through the words that go with the graphic or on the graphic, on top of the graphic, and so on and so forth.
Those were great answers. And somewhat related to, I'm just browsing through the Q&A here. There's actually 2 questions that are somewhat related, so I'm going to kind of cheat and combine them. One from Madison. What strategies do you use to balance the need for rigorous scientific detail with the need for simplicity and clarity? And also Hassel, and I apologize, I've certainly not pronounced your name correctly. There's a lot of scientific considerations to consider when you're creating a graphic. How much info is too much to include in a graphic about climate change, and how do you make those decisions?
So kind of more on the second question, I do think in climate change, there is quite a lot of context that you need to provide with certain topics that will really affect the understanding of the chart. So I do think that, like in charts of emissions, for example, I do think it's important to sort of like say whether or not you've included emissions from land use, because whether or not you have can actually really sort of change the chart. But a lot of that can be done in footnotes. I favour sort of decluttering the main bit of the chart and putting stuff like that sort of tucked away at the bottom.
Footnotes are a powerful and underutilized tool in graphics, I think.
Yeah, I think some of it gets really, Roz, you stole the words out of my mouth entirely, but I don't have much to add other than I don't think you should be negligent in trying to frame your graphic with like the appropriate head that gives the appropriate amount of context, but maybe isn't super scientific so the reader has like the gist of what you're trying to communicate. Maybe there's some caveats that you've shoved in the notes section, but like I said, I think for me, I tend towards simplicity and clarity over a lot of that detail. And like Roz was saying, just if there's some important caveats, put them in the notes section. it's hard. It's like Alberto, you're saying such interesting stuff about rule breaking charts earlier, and I kind of like, I'm cautious when I give out this advice because it's not every chart that follows this. It's not like this will work for every single thing. So I'm a little cautious giving like blanket statements like this, but I tend toward clarity and simplicity, I think.
Which is always excellent advice, to try to, the same way that we should encourage people to write as directly as possible and to write as clearly as possible, rather than sort of like creating sort of like this very Baroque style when we want to communicate clearly. We should advocate for the same thing in visualization. It is only that we should always make clear that this is just general advice, and there are always exceptions, right? There are places for visualizations that are much more intricate, much more artistic, much more expressive in some sense, right? It's like you need to find the occasion. And it is not that there are not really rules in visualization, right? But those rules are, in my opinion, just the symbols that we use and the grammar that tells us how to arrange those symbols. But the same way that it happens with writing, after you learn the symbols and you learn the grammar, what you do with them is a little bit up to you, right? It's like you just go, just see what it works, just test it. You will never know what you will discover, right? Now, in terms of deciding how much information to put in there, it always depends on the story. It's like you need to look at the story. But there are several sort of like funny tests that I have used in the past. For example, I have many friends who work in the sciences, particularly, I come from a family who works in healthcare, for example. My dad used to teach medical sciences at a university many years ago, etc. So whenever I had, for example, to do many years ago, an infographic about anatomy or about a virus or whatever, I followed the advice that all of you provided, right? Which is sound, right? Try to speak as clearly as possible, try not to overwhelm the reader, blah, blah, blah. But then I also show the graphic to a scientist. And the question that I ask is, do you feel insulted by this graphic? Do you think that, in your opinion, does this graphic oversimplify things? And the answer was, if the answer was like, no, I don't think so. I think that actually this works quite well. That's great. You know that the graphic is going to, in one sense, inform the reader because you're applying your knowledge of how to communicate journalistically and clearly, but at the same time, you are being true to the science. You are not oversimplifying the underlying science that you're trying to communicate, right? So always, in my opinion, always trust the experts. Always, in my opinion, whenever you're going to tell a story related to complex topics such as this one, something that I have learned to do myself, the sort of like the hard way, is to always try to partner up with people who are experts in this area, even if it is just as consultants, right? You have them there, you can ask them, and then you can show them your work and see, what do you think? Do you think that this oversimplifies things, or does it go too far? Although scientists never tell you that you go too far, they really want to put more stuff in there, right? So, there's this old saying that is commonly attributed to Einstein, that I don't know if it is apocryphal, it might be, but apparently at some point, Einstein, talking about the development of scientific theories, he said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? This is a great saying because it speaks about the process of simplification, right? The process of clarification. I prefer to talk about clarification, not simplification. We can reduce the amount of information that we provide in order to make our message clear, but there is always a threshold, right? That threshold is always a little bit fuzzy, but if you go beyond it, you will be oversimplifying, right? If you go way above it, then you are overcomplicating. And the middle point is what we need to strike whenever we want to communicate something as complex as climate change.
So related to this, I wanted to ask a question from Karshar, and again, I'm certainly butchering that name. Based on your experience, any rules on testing your graphics before they go out into the world, especially if it's only a small graphic? Like, do you show it to a certain number of people in a particular demographic? Do you just send it to your colleagues? How do you guys test things to make sure they're understandable before you publish?
So at The Economist, everything gets shown around to about, I'd say probably about 10 people before it gets published, which really helps in, like, people always pick up on stuff that they you thought was obvious. You can definitely become sort of too close to your work, and that you'll think like a certain concept is obvious and they'll be like, oh, this makes no sense. And that really, really helps. But obviously, like, your colleagues might be quite similar people just because they all work for the same news organization. So I actually think that's a really good argument for having like sort of diversity of backgrounds within a team. You can show them a graphic, and and also of sort of subject areas that people might know more and less about. It really helps to have that diversity.
I agree. I mean, everything gets edited for sure, but like Roz was just saying, I mean, it definitely helps to, I mean, if you're kind of experimenting on your own, I think that you would be really surprised at the reactions that just showing it to your friends and family would have. And I think that you definitely should. That probably right there is more diversity than most of us get in our jobs. And you have to buckle up, because you're not going to like all of the feedback you get. It's really frustrating, but I just encourage you to really take it into consideration. I mean, not every piece of feedback you get, you feel, might not be great, but most of it probably is. And so it can be hard to train yourself to say like, well, that's a really annoying fix, I really don't want to do it. But getting that feedback is really, it's crucial to doing this stuff. I mean, I never make something that's amazing right off the bat. I definitely do not. So
I wouldn't do testing with simple graphics like bar graphs, line charts, etc., unless that I feel that it's extremely important to do so. But certainly with bigger projects, I think that there is the opportunity for journalists to try to do a little bit more testing, talking more to people and listening to what people want to learn. That's the other thing, which should make, I think, the audience try to be more, participatory in the things that we produce. Whenever it is possible. So testing can be done informally, semi-formally, or formally. Yeah, and all of them are useful for the reasons that you have mentioned. Right? So like the informal test is just to show the work to family and friends, right? Spread it out, get opinions. If you get just one comment of a person suggesting a change, well, consider it. But if there are two people who say the same thing, then that's probably a sign that you need to change something, right? That's informal testing, which is super, super useful, very, very useful, particularly when you're in a rush, right? Which is usually the case in journalism. But then there's also semi-formal testing, which is that you can sort of like do this exact same thing in a more formal way if you have the time. So actually not just sending the graphic to people and getting feedback, but actually sitting yourself next to the person or to the people who are going to read this graphic, show them the graphic, and then have them verbalize their experience of reading the graphic. As Kennedy was saying just a minute ago, you will be horrified by how badly you understand your own work, right? So it's a humbling experience, but highly educational. I greatly, greatly, greatly encourage I encourage everybody to do this a little bit more often. We actually did this with the project that I mentioned at the very beginning, the one about the COVID, deaths of COVID around you. We did this sort of like semi-formal training when the Brazilian version of this project was created, which happened before the American version. The team that produced the graphic put together, I think that it was a group, like a diverse group of 20 people, and they actually run a little bit of like testing. And then you can do it more formally. It's like if you have the time, then you can do scientific testing, which is an extension. It makes this process of observing readers reading your graphic a little bit more rigorously. You actually code the answers, you transcribe the answers, try to find common themes in their answers, and so on and so forth. That's the type of testing that we are using, for example, in this research group about hurricane maps that I mentioned before that I'm part of, to identify things that work and things that don't work. Obviously, formal testing is a little bit more or much more unrealistic for journalistic operations, but informal and semi-formal testing, it's completely feasible in my opinion.
I will just echo the fact that it's absolutely horrifying how often you can produce a graphic that you think is incredibly clear and there would be no mistaking it, and you show it to people who are good at reading graphs and they say, what does this mean? I don't know what this is. I don't understand your axis here. I don't get what this graph is trying to tell me. It is astounding and extremely humbling. I know personally, I was really grateful for the print process, because it meant that so many people had to see every graphic that I made for the magazine. And inevitably there was someone in the really late rounds of editing where I thought it was final and it's been through 5 people, and that 6th person said, hey, what's happening here? I don't get this. And that's really invaluable. It's painful, but it's invaluable. Only somewhat related, but I think it's a really excellent question. Jaspreet asked about visualizing uncertainty. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on communicating and visualizing uncertainty in climate data to a non-expert audience. I wanted to ask about this earlier because the climate stripes, I think, are a really good example of like zero uncertainty. Like it's essentially the same data as the classic hockey stick graph, but the hockey stick graph has a confidence interval, and the stripes do not. And I'd argue that the stripes are in a lot of ways more persuasive. But I'm curious how you guys approach when you add uncertainty, or if you always add uncertainty.
So when I'm redesigning charts and scientific papers, I will quite often take uncertainty off, because often they're very cluttered and sometimes it gets in the way of sort of clearly just seeing the message of the chart, particularly if the uncertainty bars are quite small. Then there's sort of no reason to have them on there. But for a subject like climate change, where sort of tiny changes in global temperature rise have like massive impacts for the planet, actually leaving uncertainty on there is very important. So I would tend to leave it on there for a chart of global temperature or something like that. But yeah, I really think it depends on the purpose of your visualization. The purpose of the climate stripes was just to sort of provoke emotion and persuade people, and it did that really well without that. But if your chart is for a specialist audience, then they might be suspicious if you don't have an uncertainty on there.
Yeah, it's so hard to answer succinctly just in general terms, but I agree again, Roz. I kind of have the same approach too. It really is like, it kind of boils down to how people just, visualizations have to be pretty simple for people to get them. And you can't throw in too many different variables. You can give them a little bit, you can give them a basic chart with a little extra challenge, but you can't go too far, because it's really hard for people to follow what the core message is. This is stuff that you could try to get away with in framing, and like if this chart has a title or some kind of headline or something that goes along with it, you could try to get at that there is that this is like a median value or whatever it is. It just depends on the data, but you could hint at it that way. Line charts it's somewhat easier to add them in. Other chart types, it's harder. It really just depends, but it's hard for humans to kind of understand. We're not quite at that visual literacy yet, I think, to where we can add in all of the bells and whistles and all of the caveats to the data. It's tricky.
I have many thoughts, like hundreds and thousands of thoughts about uncertainty. I'm going to start sharing some resources quickly, just because, again, I don't want to monopolize the discussion. So first of all, an article that I wrote a while ago about how statisticians, scientists, etc., try to communicate uncertainty a little bit better, in which I talk not only about how to visualize uncertainty, but also about how to explain uncertainty, because there are different types of uncertainty. Right? It depends on what we're talking about. It's not all confidence intervals, which is a frequentist concept, right? There's also bias in uncertainty. It all depends on the models that are used. So how do you explain that to our lay reader? If you don't understand it well, you can't, right? It's like, so that's tricky. But when we do understand the uncertainty, sometimes uncertainty is not an add-on. It's an intrinsic part of the story. And I have a couple of examples in my most recent book. For example, in terms of reporting the results of election polls, right? If you have candidate A at 51 and candidate B at 49, you cannot say that candidate A is ahead of candidate B without considering the level of uncertainty. You can just say that they seem to be tied, right? is because the level of uncertainty, I mean, you can say it, but it's extremely risky because that very small difference is likely just the product of random sampling error. So you need to be extremely careful with that as a journalist. So understanding all those concepts, I think that is incredibly important when we work with, informing people about data, because we don't need just to visualize that uncertainty. We also need to explain to people what that uncertainty means and how to read it, how to interpret it, right? Which is quite tricky on its own. Now, talking about uncertainty in visualization, whoever asked the question, I don't remember who it was, it's a rabbit hole, right? So I'm going to just put a couple of links here that if you start following, you will have, countless hours of readings. The first one is that is the website of a couple of researchers who work in this area, in the visualization of uncertainty. One of them is Jessica Hullman, who actually has an article about why journalists don't show uncertainty in their graphics, which is this one, right? And many, many reasons. She interviewed several journalists who work in visualization. And the other one is Matthew Kay, who also works at Northwestern University, both of them, Jessica and Matt, they work in the same university. He has also worked extensively in the visualization of uncertainty and talking to people and so on and so forth. And last but not least, I have an entire Dropbox folder about the visualization of uncertainty, which I will post in the chat window as soon as I finish talking while we talk about other issues. This Dropbox link, in that Dropbox link, I collected every single paper, resource, etc., that I think might be helpful for journalists to understand how to communicate, how to explain, how to visualize uncertainty. And within the folder, I categorize all the readings from the most basic ones to the most advanced ones. And there, I mean, you have literally more than a year or two of reading. I'm going to post the link in a few minutes.
Those were excellent answers. I'm very torn here because there's a question in the chat that I think is really excellent, and it's not, I'm going to go ahead and ask it because it's not specifically related to climate data viz, but I think it is a pretty relevant question, which is I need advice on journalists interested in data viz who work in small newsrooms. Based on my experience, this ends up with the journalists doing everything on their own, from looking for data, creating the visualization, editing, and publishing, and it can be quite overwhelming. I'm curious if you guys have any advice, because I think, though not specific to climate change viz, it is a fairly common pathway still that people start out as journalists and they want to expand what they're able to do, but often that means kind of doing it on your own. And I don't know whether this is like anyone else's experience on the panel, but I'm curious if you guys have any advice.
I started out in a really small newsroom, so there was only 6 people when I joined. And I was like the first person they hired that did charts. So I would say if it's really, really small, you might not have a style guide for charts. So perhaps a good place to start is sort of thinking about a visual style guide for your organization, which can be a good way just to sort of set a few rules for yourself and sort of get a consistency in your style so that what you make sort of looks recognizably like it's the product of wherever it is you're working. That can really help it to look a bit more professional. And I'd also just try and get them to carve out some time for you for learning new skills, because if you're doing it by yourself, you'll have to do a lot of self-teaching.
That's a really good advice. I was thinking that there are communities that you can be a part of to ask questions and get help on, like Slack communities for like mapping and JavaScript and data viz and stuff like that. So you can create a community around you or join another community, especially with questions. Lots of listservs out there. And a lot of things are just so well documented. I will say that there is like, among developers particularly, I feel we all feel like we got to suffer in silence because we don't want to show our cards saying, I'm just saying there's lots of relief when people ask even like very basic questions, because we've all been there. We've all been there. We've all been nervous about, admitting to getting stuck in certain ways. And I just feel like there's an enormous amount of support for people that go through that, because I feel like it's such a relatable, relatable experience of someone's career. So it feels scary when you're starting out, but there is a lot of, I feel like nowadays, especially, there's lots of support for people that just need help or some guidance or, anything like that.
The visualization community at large, and I'm not talking just about in the news, but people who produce visualization for many other things, such as scientific issues or business analytics, data science, people who produce graphics, and all these fields are, in general, and with few exceptions, extremely welcoming and extremely helpful. I mean, there are certain forums. I'm thinking about, for instance, the Data Visualization Society, which was launched like 3 or 4 years ago, which is like you can just throw a question out there in the wild, and probably there will be someone who will answer to you. I'm thinking about, for instance, on Twitter, the hashtags related to the R programming language. And if you tweet at someone who uses R, right, regularly, and who is engaged in the R community, and you ask, how do I do this in R? You will get a question right away from someone, right? It's like, I mean, actually, if you Google, which is something that I do with my own students all the time when they ask me, how do I do this? I say, Google is your friend. Just ask, how do I do this in Illustrator? How do I do this in R? Because probably there's going to be someone in the community who has already written a tutorial on how to do that particular thing, or who has answered a question in a public forum, a question from another person that you can take advantage of. So joining these types of communities is, I think, quite important, just to get feedback, get involved, talk to other people, get feedback or provide feedback, and so on and so forth. The Data Visualization Society is one of them. IRE would be another one, which is I just posted, investigative reporters and editors, right? That would be another one that I would consider joining. And I don't know whether they are going to have their annual conference next year in person, but I strongly recommend to anybody who is interested in working with data and working with visualization in particular to try to attend the NICAR conference, which is the conference that IRE puts together every year. This is the one from 2021, which was virtual. This is a very good conference. So I would try to attend these. They offer tons of workshops and classes and things like that. And you get to know people who work in the field, which is also quite important. Try to network, try to create a group of friends and so on and so forth that you can communicate on a regular basis. And then try to find meetups in your area, right? Go to meetup.com, and I don't know whether that is actually the website, but if there is, meetup.com. Go to meetup.com and search data visualization or data analytics or data science. There's probably groups in your area that meet on a regular basis that that join together, group at some point every month or something like that, and talk about all these things.
I would also add that in my experience, one advantage in being a small newsroom is that if you are the one person who makes graphs, you have a lot of latitude to do what you want, like to make your own visual style for the whole brand is a wild opportunity that you will never get at a massive newsroom. And it's really cool to have the latitude to do it yourself. So it is totally overwhelming, but I would also say that take advantage while you can of actually being able to do it all yourself, because it's pretty cool. I had a lot more questions, but
may I add something before we move to the next one? I don't know who said before, we've all been there. I was alone in a graphics department in my 20s, right? So I know how it feels to be overwhelmed. Oh my God, right? I'm the only one doing this crap over here. What am I going to do? And I survived. I'm not a particularly smart person. If I survive, anybody can survive, right? It's like, it can be done. It's a craft. Your first graphics are going to be complete crap. Don't worry about that. The one that you will produce tomorrow is going to be better. And then the day after is going to be better. And then the day after is going to be better. So don't judge yourself in comparison to the other 3 people in this conversation, for example, right? Judge your own work in comparison to what you did yesterday. And if it is better, then you're in the right track.
That was very wise advice and very apt since we are at the end here. I had a lot more questions and time kind of flew, but before I throw to Dan, I just want to thank you guys, Alberto and Roz and Kennedy. This was really, truly a delight. And thank you to everyone who's listening, whose faces I cannot see. And Dan, you have some announcements.
Yeah, what a great discussion this was. Just the perfect combination of mind expanding concepts and very down to earth practical advice, which is just what we want from these. So the good news, everyone, is I know people had a lot more questions. The chat in particular, please know that when this is archived, as it will be in it, hopefully by tomorrow, at journalism.nyu.edu/KC, the chat is archived too. And so you'll be able to see all the resources that Kennedy and Alberto and Roz and Sara put out there. So I'm sure we're going to get a lot of viewers watching the archive version on this because it was just so darn useful. I just want to remind everyone that we will have one more of these for the semester on November 30th. It will not be through YouTube, but again, you can find out all about it at journalism.nyu.edu/KC for Kavli Conversations. And it will be about localizing specialized coverage, which is another huge growth area, thank goodness, after a very tough period in our business. So with that, I will thank our panelists, especially our moderator, Sara, who did a fantastic job. I'll stop the recording and say goodbye to everyone.